Along with our partners, the Consensus for Development Reform and the Modernizing Foreign Assistance Network, I want to welcome you to the Center for Global Development. Today's event is very timely on a number of different levels. First, leaders and officials from throughout the world are going to gather in New York in a couple of weeks to formalize the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs. Their objective is to establish a new and updated development agenda that'll take us through 2030. While much of the attention will naturally focus on shifting from process to implementation and accelerating development outcomes. The SDGs, as many of you know, include 17 goals and a dizzying 169 targets, which is almost a paralyzingly broad scope. So as such, how can the development community use and draw upon the most pressing priorities of ordinary citizens throughout the world to help focus this very large and unwieldy agenda? Today we're going to hear about one region in particular, Sub-Saharan Africa. This new Pew Research Center survey gauged opinions and perceptions of over 9,000 people across 9 African countries through in-person interviews. Its substantive scope is quite broad and quite rich, ranging from things like economic confidence and concerns to other development concerns like healthcare, education, and corruption, as well as confidence in both domestic and international organizations. On this latter topic, unlike many other public attitude surveys, this Pew survey asked a lot of very specific questions about foreign aid agencies as well as foreign companies, which I think will be quite interesting. Which brings me to the second reason why this event is very topical. Along with other donor governments, the United States is repeatedly committed to embrace, support, and implement country-led development approaches. Naturally, one would assume that this would include aligning U.S. assistance programs and projects with the priorities of ordinary citizens and their elected governments throughout the world. Yet we still too often find that U.S. foreign assistance priorities and programs are emanating from Washington, D.C., whether they're due to congressional directives or top-down presidential initiatives, and much less responding to and reflecting the priorities that are coming from different regions and ordinary people. Based on discussions over time with U.S. agency and congressional staff, it's clear that we're still not doing nearly enough to gauge these priorities and concerns and then actually act upon them in a concerted and systemic way. There are many ways to actually do this. There are also a lot of political and bureaucratic challenges to doing it well. Yet one of the greatest and most underutilized resources are ongoing public attitude surveys that are gathered and conducted by both African and American organizations. This includes groups like the Pew Research Center, of course, but also others like NOI Polls in Nigeria, or U-Report in Uganda, or even Afrobarometer. With this broader framing in mind, I'm very excited by the group of presenters and panelists that we have here today. First, we're going to start with a presentation by Katie Simmons, an Associate Director at Pew Research Center. Katie was one of the key people that oversaw this new survey and is one of the co-authors of the report that is being released today globally. And as Katie was telling me backstage, Pew is also doing a series of rollout events on the continent. Lagos today, they're going to do Abuja and a number of locations in South Africa as well. She's going to walk us through some of the key survey findings and the policy relevant results. So thank you very much for being here with us today, Katie. After this, we're going to have a panel discussion about what these results and these types of surveys could or should mean for U.S. policymakers and other stakeholders as well. In that context, we've assembled a great group of panelists. First, we have Dr. Yaw Ansu, the chief economist at the African Center for Economic Transformation, or ACET. And we're going to keep our fingers crossed that technology works in our favor with Dr. Ansu. For those of you who don't know ACET, it is one of the most influential African think tanks, particularly amongst those that have a broader regional mission. And its vision is that by 2025, all African countries will drive their own agenda and transformation agendas, led by the private sector and backed by capable states with strong institutions and good policies. He's written extensively on a broad range of African economic issues, including ACET's most recent flagship product, the African Transformation Reports, which we had the honor of hosting Dr. Ansu for an event on this report last April. Before this, being at ACET, he spent nearly 3 decades in a variety of different positions at the World Bank. So we're very honored to have him and look forward to his thoughts, reactions, and ideas as well. We also have 2 excellent DC-based panelists who have been very key players and voices on a broad range of U.S. development policies, including efforts to promote U.S. foreign aid reforms over the years. And my hope is that they're going to help tie the discussion back to these reform efforts and the prospects for further change going forward. First, we have Ambassador Mark Green. He's the president of the International Republican Institute and the co-chair for the Consensus for Development Reform, who, along with MFAN, is one of the most active groups in town promoting a U.S. foreign aid reform agenda. From 1999 to 2007, Ambassador Green represented the 8th Congressional District of Wisconsin, and while in Congress, he was very active in helping shape a number of very big initiatives, including the MCC as well as PEPFAR. After that, he was the ambassador to Tanzania, where he oversaw the largest, I believe still largest, MCC compact in history, as well as significant PEPFAR programs. I should also say that IRI regularly conducts its own polls on a range of different issues, primarily focused on democratic and governance-related issues, but a range of other issues, both in Africa and throughout the world, so he'll have a very unique perspective from a range of different angles. So, Ambassador, we're very happy to have you with us today. Second, we have Nora O'Connell. She's Associate Vice President at Save the Children. Nora oversees Save the Children's Public Policy and Advocacy Department, which is responsible for the organization's work on U.S. humanitarian and development policies, including aid effectiveness and the post-2015 agenda, which is a great dovetail with some of the context that I referenced earlier. In addition, she's a key player within MFAN, and she's the co-chair of the working group focused on promoting country ownership and country-led development approaches. Nora, welcome and thank you for being here. I believe we have some documentation from both CDR and MFAN about the issues that they're championing out front. And I should also, in full transparency, I believe in full transparency, I should note that I'm a member of both of the organizations. And just as importantly, we want to hear from those of you here today who have both an interest and a stake in these important issues and promoting a more inclusive and representative process for advancing development outcomes and objectives, not only in sub-Saharan Africa, but throughout the world. Now, without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Katie, who's going to give us a brief presentation of this new survey, and then we'll open it up with a panel discussion afterwards. In your hands, Katie.
Good morning.
Thank you, Ben, for that very nice introduction, and we'd like to thank the Center for Global Development. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? I'll just speak. Ben, and thank you, Center for Global Development, for
for hosting this very nice event and for giving us an opportunity to present our findings. As Ben mentioned, my colleague Richard Wyke, who is also a co-author on this report, is almost simultaneously presenting these results in Lagos, Nigeria, and will be then traveling to South Africa to present the results there. And we hope that people find the results that we have here informative and helpful in the lead up to the UN Conference on the Sustainable Development Goals. Before I start walking through our results, I wanted to give you a little bit of background on the Pew Research Center and what it is that we do. We were established in 1996. We are funded primarily by the Pew Charitable Trust. The mission of the organization is to provide objective, high-quality information to the public and policymakers. To that end, we are a nonprofit and we are nonpartisan. We do not take positions on issues and we do not advocate. We have done research in over 80 countries since 2002. Our research spans a wide range of topics, from American politics to science and technology to global public opinion on a range of issues. All of our research is publicly available on our website, and our data sets are available for download within a year or two of our completing the survey. The results I'm going to talk about today come from our 2015 Global Attitude Survey. We surveyed 40 countries around the world with nationally representative surveys in each country between March 25th and May 27th. In Africa, the survey covered 9 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. You can see the list here. These surveys were done face-to-face, so they were in-person surveys, and they were conducted by local survey firms, research firms, so we work with people on the ground who know the country very well. Our margin of error is between 3.5% to 4%, and I'm more than happy to talk lots about our methodology at the end if you have any questions. So the context of why we did this survey is that we know that the Millennium Development Goals are coming to an end, and the UN is going to ratify the Sustainable Development Goals in their committee meeting next week. And so we wanted to produce results about what Africans think about are the challenges in their countries and how they want to go about addressing those challenges, to provide information for policymakers as they think about sustainable development goals, but also for the public. So one of the major takeaways from the survey is that people in sub-Saharan Africa are very happy with their economies for the most part and very optimistic about the economic future, especially when you look at them compared with the rest of the world. A median of 48% in these 9 African countries say that their economy is doing well. This is comparable to what we see in Asia, where 51% say this among the countries that we surveyed. This is much higher than other regions around the world, for example, Latin America, the Middle East, or even Europe. Europe tends to be at the bottom. We also find that a median of 60% among these 9 countries say that their economy is going to continue to grow and get better over the next 12 months. And another 56% say that the children today, when they grow up, are going to be better off financially than their parents. So there is real optimism in these 9 countries. It's very instructive, especially when compared to Europe, who tends to be at the bottom on this chart on each one of these variables. A driving factor in these attitudes about the economy is economic growth. And so we find that the more that people have experienced economic growth both recently and over the past decade, the more likely they are to be happy with their economy and to think things are going to get even better in the future. So on this chart, the x-axis is the average GDP growth between 2005 and 2014. The y-axis is the percentage in the country who says that their children are going to be better off financially than their parents. And what you can see here is there's a strong relationship between the 2 variables, but also that Africa stands out. They've had high growth and they're very optimistic for the future. So for example, Nigeria had an average of 7% GDP growth between 2005 and 2014, and 84% of Nigerians say the next generation is going to be better off. Compare that with France, where it's just been 1% GDP growth over the past decade, and only 14% think the next generation is going to be better off. Nonetheless, even with this widespread economic contentment and economic optimism, people in Africa face some real challenges. They see some real challenges for themselves in their countries. Perhaps interestingly, at the top of that list of challenges is actually lack of jobs. So even though they're unhappy with they're happy with their economy, they want more growth and they want more economic opportunities. And so we see a median of 88% say a lack of employment opportunities is a very big problem in their country. But we also find a range of issues besides the economy that they list as real challenges. So a median of at least 8 in 10 or more say that healthcare, education, government corruption, crime are very big issues for their countries. The lack of access to clean water does rise to major concern in some countries. In Senegal, Burkina Faso, and Ethiopia, this is one of the top 3 concerns that the public cited. We also find that energy shortages are one of the top 3 problems in Ghana and Ethiopia. Somewhat lower down the list is poor infrastructure such as roads and bridges, food shortages, a lack of access to clean toilets, and pollution. At the bottom of this list is citizen engagement. A median of just 39% are very concerned about citizen engagement in their country. So we know from the previous question the range of problems that people face in these 9 sub-Saharan African countries. What we also wanted to know is what is the most important priority for the future? If you could pick one issue, what would you want your country to focus on? And we find that in 8 out of 9 countries, healthcare tops the list. A median of 38% across all 9 countries say this should be the #1 priority. This is especially high in Senegal and Burkina Faso, where more than half say that this is really their key concern that they want to focus on. Education comes in second. A median of 23% say education should be the primary focus. And this actually tops the list in South Africa, where 29% say education should be the primary priority for the future. So there are obviously a range of proposals about how to address these challenges. And so we wanted to understand from these 9 sub-Saharan African publics, what did they think about the organizations and institutions that might be addressing these challenges in their country, and how much confidence do they have in them? So we asked them, how confident are you that each of the following organizations or groups will help solve the major problems in our country? You can see a median of 78% say that they are very or somewhat confident that their national governments will help solve these problems. So there's generally, national government comes out on top. But they are also very confident in foreign aid organizations. 70% say they are very or somewhat confident that foreign aid organizations will do something to address the challenges that they face. Domestic companies and foreign companies also do relatively well. At least 6 in 10 say that these companies are going to do something about the problems in their country, are going to be a help. I will point out that very few people say that they are very confident in any one of these institutions or organizations. The only place where we find a majority saying that they are very confident is in Nigeria about the national government. And part of that is the survey was conducted a month after the election, so there's probably quite a bit of optimism given the peaceful, successful election that they had there. But everywhere else, we do not find majorities saying they're very confident. So there are definitely signs that there are some concerns about these institutions and organizations as well. We asked the 9 publics whether they thought that their country needed more foreign aid than it gets now, less foreign aid, or about the same. And we find widespread support for getting more foreign aid. A median of 68% say their country needs more foreign aid. And this is more than 8 in 10 in Senegal, Burkina Faso, and Uganda. The clear outlier here is South Africa. Just 26% say they need more foreign aid in South Africa, and an equal percentage says they need less. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of confidence in government, but there are also some concerns. And so we delved a little bit deeper into attitudes about the government, trying to understand what are the positive and negative aspects about the government. I'd already mentioned that the government corruption is seen as one of the major problems in these countries. A median of 8 in 10 say that it's a very big problem. And this includes 92% in Tanzania, 86% in Nigeria, so very much a widespread concern. We also asked them, is the government run for the benefit of all people in the country or just the benefit of a few groups in the country? And we find that a median of 59% across these countries say it's for the benefit of just a few groups. So there's a real concern that there's not an equal benefit coming from what the government is doing. Tanzania, Nigeria, and Ghana are particularly critical on this aspect about the government. We do find the only place we find a majority saying that the government benefits everyone is in Burkina Faso. In Burkina Faso, they also were more optimistic, more confident in the national government to do things about national problems. 79% were confident in the national government. So there's generally more positive attitudes there than in other countries. We also asked a question about whether people would be willing to have would prefer higher taxes so that the government could provide more services, or would they prefer lower taxes, even if this means the government would provide fewer services. And there's lukewarm support for higher taxes. We get a median of 47% choosing that option and a median of 42% saying they would prefer lower taxes. This could be in part due to attitudes about the government effectiveness and worries about government corruption. It could also just be a reaction to the word taxes and not wanting to have higher taxes. The only places where we see more than half supporting higher taxes for more services are Ethiopia, Senegal, and Ghana. But for the most part, there's less support for this idea. Moving on to foreign aid organizations. Consistent with the fact that a median of 70% are confident that they can help solve problems, we find pretty positive attitudes about foreign aid organizations. So we asked them a range of descriptions, words, or phrases, and asked people how well do these describe foreign aid organizations. A median of 68% say effective describes them well. Another 60% say they benefit people in need. At the same time, we also find that 53% think that these programs can be corrupt, and 45% can say that they can be inefficient. So we have positive attitudes, but also some serious concerns. This table just outlines the country-by-country results on this question. And consistent with the previous slide, you find that in most of the countries, the top descriptor is a positive one. It's either effective or benefit people in need. But in Tanzania and Burkina Faso, corrupt rises to the top. This is the highest percentage in terms of the descriptors that they think of when they think about foreign aid organizations and their programs. But I will note that people can hold both positive and negative attitudes at the same time. In Tanzania, 70% say these programs are corrupt, but 68% say they're effective as well. And a broad majority in Tanzania want more foreign aid. So attitudes about foreign aid organizations can be complicated. It's not all positive, but it's also not all negative. Shifting gears a little bit, we also asked questions about foreign companies involved in extractive industries. Foreign investment and obviously natural resources have been a big part of Africa's growth over the past decade, and so we wanted to understand how Africans feel about these types of companies. In general, they have pretty positive views of these companies. A median of 63% say that foreign companies involved in the oil or mining industry have a good impact on their country. More than 7 in 10 say this in Kenya, Nigeria, and Uganda. Even in South Africa, 53% say this. So there's an overall positive attitude towards these foreign companies involved in these types of industries. I'll note we asked about mining in 8 of the 9 countries, and we asked about oil in Nigeria. But as with foreign aid and as with the government, it's not all positive and it's not all negative. So we also asked about phrases and how well they describe these companies involved in natural resources and extractives. And in 5 of the 9 countries, you find that a positive descriptor comes to the top. They provide jobs for local workers. They contribute to the country's economic growth. Overall, a median of 67% say they provide jobs. A median of 59% say they contribute to economic growth. But a median of 61% also say that they ruin the environment. And this is the top descriptor in Ghana, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, and Tanzania. I will also note here that Nigeria is a very good example of holding both positive and negative attitudes. So 71% in Nigeria say they ruin the environment, but 68% say they contribute to economic growth. And overall, 74% of Nigerians say that these companies are having a good impact on their country. So there's confidence in a range of institutions and organizations, companies as well, but there's also some serious doubts and serious concerns. With that, I will end my presentation. Thank you.
All right. And I've been informed that Dr. Ansu is connected as well, which, yes, there he is. Excellent. I'm glad that the technology is working with us, Dr. Ansu. Do we have sound with you? We have echo. Okay, so bear with us while we figure this out. I was going to turn to Dr. Ansu first. Let's see if we got the sound figured out. Katie, thank you so much for that presentation. And I think what's really clear is that the results have a lot of richness to them and a lot of layering and complexity, which frankly could lead us in any one of 30 different directions for a conversation. So let's see how we do. And all of you here, keep us honest, and we're going to open it up to a question and answer session very soon. As I mentioned, we definitely want to hear what you're thinking and your reactions are. Dr. Ansu, let's start with you. So I'm not sure if you were able to hear the introduction at the beginning for both you and for ASET, but the organization, and you in particular, are very active in terms of promoting an African-led growth and transformation agenda, as well as advising a range of different governments on specific issues. You've been doing a lot on the mining sector in Ghana recently, as well as other countries as well. I wanted to turn to you for just a couple of moments to get your thoughts on this survey, and does it dovetail with some of the things that you're hearing from key actors, governments, businesses, individuals in West Africa, East Africa, elsewhere? Just wanted to get some quick opening thoughts from you, and then we're going to do the same with the other panelists, and then have a back and forth.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much. Even though my following of the presentations were a bit interrupted, I had the opportunity to go through the background material. And first, I must congratulate the Pew Research Center for taking this initiative to try to inform U.S. foreign policy, aid policy, with the views from the ground. Overall, I find the results very, most along the lines of what I would expect. And in fact, if I look at page 15 of the survey, it's clear. Can you hear me?
Yes, it's perfect. I was just asking them to turn the volume up a little bit, but I think we can hear you very well now.
Okay. That the four important problems that people identify, the first were jobs, second, healthcare, third, education, and then the fourth, government corruption. And I think, to me, from what I've seen sitting here in Ghana and other African countries, this resonates very well. I mean, there are other things like infrastructure and energy. I'll put them together, and that's also very important. But what I would say, though, that in a sense, these the jobs, health, education, government corruption, they are not four independent things. They are very much interrelated. Because if people have good, productive, well-paying jobs, by and large, they can really take care of their health and education needs. And so how to get growth going and in a way that creates employment opportunities, to me, is central to the discussion. And that also then comes into, that brings into the fore government management of the economy to provide a type of infrastructure, regulations, policies, and also the support for the private sector to create the jobs that are necessary. So overall, I think it's a very rich survey, something that I'm very keen now to share with my colleagues here at ASET And I really encourage this type of effort. Congratulations for doing it.
Thank you, Dr. Ansu. There's a couple of things that I really want to come back to you on in a moment, but thank you for those opening thoughts and reactions. Ambassador, I'm almost scared to come to you because you could come at this issue from probably 7 different angles, given the depth and breadth of your experience in the past, whether it's on the ground experience in Tanzania as a congressman that is passing legislation that shapes the activities at a more macro level, or from IRI or the CDR angles that you currently hold. So I'm not even going to try. So if you want to share a few quick thoughts as well, we would love to hear them.
Sure. First off, is that better? There we go.
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly.
A couple of thoughts. First off, I think there are a couple of limitations on the survey that we all need to keep in mind. Number one, when we look at attitudes towards businesses, attitudes towards foreign aid organizations, they are complicated in that you've got respondents having different feelings, but that's in part because we're not asking them which statement best typifies their attitudes towards those organizations. And I think that would provide additional clarity. But I think the other piece to it, and maybe this is something that we should talk about at greater length, we have to remember that this survey deals with Africans who are 18 and older. Well, the median age of a Tanzanian is 17. The median age of a Ugandan is 16. Tanzania has elections next month, and there are 5 million first-time voters. In other words, 5 million who have just become old enough to vote. So I think the survey results are very useful and very informative, but it's important to try to break out youth attitudes because that rising demographic is going to be a key challenge and opportunity for policymakers, businesses, implementation partners on foreign assistance. So I think that's real important. At IRI, we've launched something called Generation Democracy, which is to try to pull together young people around the world, in particular in Africa, but elsewhere, to try to foster engagement by young Africans in design of policy, in feedback into their governments, to have a constructive opportunity to engage in the democratic process. And I think that's terrifically important. When you break out youth issues, you get even stronger results than the results that we've seen. For example, you saw those numbers on jobs for Tanzania, but if you ask Tanzanians of all ages about youth unemployment, and is the fact that there are a lack of economic opportunities for young people, is that a problem? The numbers are off the chart. Because of the rising youth bulge, I think Africans of all ages recognize it's a very important priority and should be for all of us, helping to find ways to provide real opportunities for young Africans with this rising demographic, but also ways to engage and to bring them into the constructive democratic process. And the other piece that I would point to, and is very much part of what the Consensus for Development Reform believes, and I suspect MFAN as well, is that you really do need to have U.S. and Western assistance priorities shaped by the views on the ground. It's very, very important. One of my frustrations as an ambassador, every year ambassadors were required to create mission strategic plans, and I made the mistake of actually taking it seriously. And we did an off-site retreat, and we had engagement with our local Tanzanian partners, and we constructed this elaborate mission strategic plan. I was very proud of it, and that was the last anybody ever heard of it when we sent it to Washington, D.C., because money never follows mission strategic plans. So, and I'm sure my former colleagues and those who are serving these days would really echo these comments. So whether you are the USAID mission director, or you're the chief of the embassy, chief of mission, you have these ideas based upon what you see, and I think much of that's reflected in these surveys, what the top priorities are, yet combination of executive branch initiatives and congressional earmarks so narrows the room for being able to address those challenges, it creates a great deal of frustration for our folks who are in the field, but also that's how you get to those foreign aid is inefficient answers, because you see a disconnect between needs as expressed and what we do from back here. So we at the Consensus for Development Reform have the revolutionary idea of believing that the Mission Strategic Plan should actually mean something, and that it should be binding, and that funding should follow it, and that missions should be evaluated based upon what's in the Mission Strategic Plan, and maybe that would help to address the disconnect.
That's great. Thank you, Ambassador. Nora, I have the same challenge with you in terms of which angle to take, but the one modest request that I would have, like the Ambassador, is you tie it back to some of the work that you're doing either with MFAN and SAVE on some of these country-led approaches as well. But any thoughts or reactions to the survey that you'd want to flag?
Well, first
Initial
of all,
thoughts.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here. And I would just start by reminding ourselves of something that is actually credited to Einstein for saying, which is that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Now, how is that relevant to international development? Because while we have seen tremendous progress in the world, we also know that the history of international development is littered with failures that didn't succeed because they failed to build in the countries themselves, whether in setting the priorities or in implementation or in resourcing these things. And so MFAN was actually created in 2007 by a group of think tanks and NGOs and academics who came together to basically say, stop the insanity. Development is critical to the world that we want to see, and we need to harness the political will to make sure that these things that we know don't work don't keep happening, and the things that we do know that work keep happening. And so since its beginning, country ownership has really been at the core of the MFAN agenda. And what's exciting about that is actually it's been an issue of bipartisan cooperation, which if you've been in Washington for any period of time, you will see that happening less and less, unfortunately. But we saw really important reforms under the Bush administration with the creation of the MCC. We have champions on both sides of the aisle in the House and Senate. And we've also been really working with the Obama administration, where we've seen real political leadership on country ownership and on reform. We've seen some policy and some technical guidance come out, but we haven't really seen it systematically translate into how development is happening differently on the ground. So as MFAN, that's what we see as our challenge and opportunity over the next 18 months. How do we lock in these things where we've gotten the political wins, but it's not yet translating to what's happening at the mission level? It's not yet embedded into the DNA of how our assistance programs are working, whether you're talking about MCC or PEPFAR or USAID. So that's what we're really focused on, is how we can lock in these wins and do what we know works, and also measure what we know works.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you so much for that. That's very, very insightful and very helpful. Dr. Ansu, I want to come back to you on some of the issues that the Ambassador and Nora just raised. So, for groups like ours, our natural audience is mostly DC policymakers and actors, while ASETS is regional organizations, whether it's the governments across the continent or the African Development Bank or UNECA or other actors that are helping to shape policy in the region. But in terms of, I'd love to get your thoughts on tying it back to what's going on where we're physically located right here, in terms of some recommendations, ideas, thoughts in terms of making sure that there are more concerted steps to align U.S. policy and programs with the things that you're hearing and that you're proposing. And by the way, for those for those of you who haven't seen ASET's African Transformation Report, I highly recommend it. A tremendous amount of work clearly went into it. It's very rich and very deep, so there's a lot of ideas in there as well. But are there any messages that you would deliver back, Dr. Ansu, either from your personal perspective or also enlightened by a lot of the dialogue that you're having with governments and regional organizations?
Thanks, Ben. in a way, some of the things that I would like to see changed in the focus of foreign assistance to Africa reflected in the way that the Pew Research results were represented. I mean, clearly, if you look at it again on page 15, the main problem that Africans identify in the 9 countries and practically all the countries was employment. But the presentation, when you come into the summary and stuff, highlights health and education, which has been over the past 20 or so, 30 years, foreign assistance to Africa has been focused on social services. Oh, let's go help these poor Africans. Things that, touch our people's heart. And while that's appreciated, ultimately that's not what's going to help Africa. It's what Africans can produce for themselves that will have a lasting impact. So I would have preferred that the employment issues and all the myriad unemployment issues and all the myriad causes that feed into it, I would have liked to see it highlighted a lot more than is done in this report. The report sort of hides it aside from economic issues, then it goes on to health and education. I think we need to put the employment issues front and center and what is required for people to create jobs for themselves, mostly in the private sector, and what government's positive role to support the private sector to create a job, I think should be much more at the center of our foreign assistance than what has been so far. We need to de-emphasize a bit the humanitarian aspects of foreign assistance and focus on creating employment.
Thank you very much. So I want to go back to the ambassador and Nora, and also you, Katie, on a question. So I had a somewhat difficult interaction. It wasn't heated, but maybe a disappointing interaction with a long-term congressional staffer on one of the key appropriations committees. Probably spent 15 years in this job.
That's a problem, actually.
And I asked him, very, very nice gentleman. I asked him, how often, or if at all, have you looked at, been passed, or consumed surveys of what people's most pressing priorities are, either on a standalone basis, or are you hearing it come from the administration in terms of their requests of Congress for specific programs and projects? And the response that I got was, never once. What are you talking about? Never once in 10, 15 years. So some of the challenges that you talked about, Ambassador, in terms of actually having a strategic plan that is tied to resources and execution comes from Congress. There's a lot of different contributing factors. So I'm going to put you in a little bit of a hot seat, but I also want to hear from the two of you in terms of addressing those types of constraints and challenges. I know SAVE is very outspoken, along with MFAN, in engaging and educating on Capitol Hill. But are there prospects? Are there angles that we can take on that side? And then, Katie, I would also love to hear from you in terms of your best sense at this point in terms of your consumers within the policy community. Is there outreach? Is there demand? Obviously, you're a resource-constrained organization, so there's only so much you can do. But I personally am very, very focused and passionate about creating some of these linkages, because there are breaks right now in terms of information flow and feedback loops. So open it up to any one of you on this issue, because it is a big constraint.
And I'd like to just quickly comment on a couple of things that we've heard. First off, our friend in Accra, I think he is absolutely right. I think, and I'm a longtime consumer of the Pew Global Attitude Surveys. I think it's great. I think they're a wonderful work product and very useful. I think Pew would be the first to say that they don't have an unlimited space to ask deep dive questions and explore each of these issues further. With respect to issues of foreign aid, I wonder what the answer would be, the percentages would be, if you ask, for example, Ghanaians, do you agree that one of the goals of foreign assistance should be to end its own need? Do you believe that one of the goals of foreign assistance should be to build the capacity of the country in which you're working so that Ghanaians can take on challenges themselves? I suspect it would be off the charts positive. You know, as a congressman, I used to hear all the time, well, we give them so much money, why don't they like us? Right? You always hear that. Well, my answer is always, look, it's not a natural state of man for people to say, we need more assistance, please give us more assistance, and expect people to like that, right? Every country, every human being has pride and wants the ability to take on challenges themselves and have opportunities to do so. So I think that's real important as we take a look at this. With respect to helping policymakers and their staff sort of engage more with attitudes on the local level, again, I go back to it. In the embassies that I have visited around the continent of Africa, they are led by and populated by wonderful, dedicated professionals who have devoted most of their lives to the cause of effective development and lifting lives from poverty. It's truly wonderful. But yet we don't listen to them. So as ambassador, I used to walk around the embassy, and if I saw any of my staff, I'd say, what are you doing here? Get out. Get outside these walls. Go meet with people. Go listen to people. Go and talk to people. So, and I think almost every ambassador does that. So we send them out to listen, to learn, to see, and they come back, and again, they help to construct these strategies to alleviate poverty, to build governing capacity, but yet back here we completely ignore that. And so again, I think if you actually pay attention to the work of the professionals on the ground, in the plans and strategies they create, and actually lift them up to the light of day and say, you know, we are a compassionate nation, let's actually help to take on these challenges as Ghanaians or Tanzanians have suggested they be done through the eyes of our professionals, I think you get tremendous results. I think that there's a vast opportunity to make a difference.
What do you think, Nora?
I would love to jump in on this question of the use of survey data, and I think we're all hearing a lot about polling data in our own context right now. And I think one thing that actually comes across very clearly is polling data should not be a policy-making tool, right? So I don't think any more than we want it to happen here in the US, nor do we want politicians here looking at polling data for Africa.
Don't let Donald Trump ruin the...
And, you know, especially when you're looking at sort of Pan-African data, it's actually least useful. But what I think is really exciting about this survey data is the potential to actually dig down on subgroups. And why this is so critical is Ben started us out by talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, or the global goals that we're all embracing. One of the biggest shifts in the global goals is this focus on inequality. There's tremendous progress that's happening. We see the optimism that Africans have about their future that is actually fueled by the actual data around economic growth and other kinds of progress. But there are huge numbers of people who are being left behind. And the commitment of the SDGs is to close the inequality gaps and make sure no one is left behind. The problem is that the groups that are left behind are those that have the least political voice in their society. And no one knows this better than Ambassador Green and the work that IRI does. There are reasons why people are often left behind, and often very political reasons, and they often have very little political voice. Now, the findings that were presented in the aggregate report didn't pull out these sort of subgroups of data, but we did see it in places. We saw places where the urban-rural divide was called out, or in Nigeria, different ethnic group divides. And it isn't always safe for these most deprived groups to actually speak out publicly. But I think there's really exciting potential for survey data to be something that pulls out the priorities and the needs of the most deprived groups who have the same rights as everyone else, but may not have that political voice, and to elevate it. And what polling data is it's a pulse check. We're doing so, this is what we're hearing in a broad sense, here's what our plan is. Do they match? And if not, to ask the questions, why not? So I think it's a really useful tool, but most useful at the country level and at the mission level rather than the Washington level.
Sorry, because there's another, I think, potential use for good survey data, and that is to help the countries that we're partnering with to take on these challenges. A lot of times these are countries that are in transition from either socialism or more authoritarian structures, and so there isn't a tradition of being able to measure constituent attitudes and needs. So some of the polling that we do, we actually test on constituent issues. We don't tell governments what to do. We just say, look, here's what your constituents are saying, and to help them design that responsive agenda so that, again, we all hope that we all work ourselves out of jobs. I mean, we all hope that we help to empower governments to take on these challenges themselves.
And if I could just build on the congressional education piece for a moment, because I think the example that Ambassador Green gave at the beginning is really critical. He told the story of all the work he went through in Tanzania to develop a mission strategy and that was thrown out in Washington. Unfortunately, that is not just an anecdote. The USAID Inspector General's report that came out earlier this year found out that nearly half of the community development cooperation strategies, which is a mouthful of a way of saying the country-owned development plans for USAID, nearly half of them that were developed had to be thrown out and redone because what countries came up with didn't match the budget realities in Washington. And some of those budget realities were from Congress, and some of those budget realities were from the administration itself. So how we in Washington continue to do that education and create the political space for people at the field level to actually reflect the local priorities will be really important. And one of the most important ways that we've found to do this, and I'm sure many of you could have the opportunity to do this as well if you're not already, is when we have people actually coming from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America to Washington, bringing them to the Hill. Because not enough members of Congress actually have the opportunity to travel themselves or to enough places. But as Ambassador Green said, there are phenomenal leaders throughout Africa, throughout Asia, throughout Latin America who are changing their countries. But we're sometimes helping them and we're sometimes getting in their way. But when members of Congress and their staff meet these leaders and understand their transformational agendas for their countries, that's where you really see a shift in political will. And we have some great champions like Congressman Poe. We have the Caucus on Effective Foreign Assistance. We've had champions on the Senate side for years. So we do really see that there are members of Congress who get it, but it is upon us to be able to bring those examples to Washington.
Great, thank you. I want to bring it back to Dr. Ansu in a second, but Katie, I don't want to put you in an awkward position. And part of what we're trying to do here is bring the information that organizations like the Pew Research Center that are collecting and helping disseminate it, right? I'd love to get just a sense in terms of how much interaction an organization like yours has with policymakers, whether they're in the executive branch or on Congress. Is there any existing activity that's going on there? And that'll give us a semblance of how much more we as a group need to do in terms of getting this kind of information out there.
Sure. So a big part of our mission, as I mentioned earlier, is reaching out to both the public and policymakers to disseminate our findings. And so we do this in sort of multiple ways, multiple strategies. So one thing that we have that's connected to this report is we have something an online interactive that has all of the data very easily to digest. It's put together in nice graphics, but it's also available that it's very mobile friendly. So what we're hoping is that people on the ground in Africa can use this and show this and take this to people and talk to them about it and use that as a way to do that, and can also do that here. So that's one way that we do that. We also do a considerable outreach to journalists under the idea that journalists are one of the ways that information gets out to both the public and to policymakers. And so we reach out to journalists in Washington, D.C., but also in Europe and in Africa. And so we have a very coordinated campaign to make sure they have this information and use it and help them use it. If they have questions, we engage with them. But then we also, as part of our dissemination, we reach out and do briefings for policymakers and organizations who are interested in these topics. And so we have done presentations and briefings on all of our reports for the State Department, for Congress, for a lot of people in Washington, D.C. Also talked to the European Parliament, European Commission. We go all over Asia and talk to government officials there, and also As I mentioned, my colleague Richard Wyke is in Africa talking to officials and organizations there. And so it is our goal to make sure that this information is in people's hands so that they can use it if they think it's appropriate.
That's great. Thank you. That's good to hear. All right, I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to open it up, and then. But I want to bring it back to something that Nora's mentioned a couple of times now on the Sustainable Development Goals, and I mentioned this at the very beginning, just in terms of how incredibly expansive the agenda appears, at least to me. So, Dr. Ansu, in terms of the agenda that ACET is advancing based upon policy research and interaction, again, with regional institutions, whether it's the AU, AFDB, others, can you give us a sense in terms of, in your view, the alignment of the SDGs with some of the strategies, transformation agendas that are emanating from the region? Because it's kind of hard not to be aligned because the scope is so broad. But in terms of some of the emphasis that's coming out and what we might expect in a couple of weeks in New York, just hoping you can give us a bit of a gut check in terms of are the SDGs and the process and the communication surrounding it resonating in Ghana, for example, and not just resonating, is it relevant? I think that's a helpful gut check in your view.
Well, that's a tough one. In my view, the results of the SDG and all the targets and goals that we have reflect the process. Once you have so many people and so many actors, all with particular interest groups, and you want to accommodate it, and you need to have a document passed, that's what you get.
Yep.
And it is what it is, and we have to take it and move with it. But in ASET, we believe that a country that has a leadership that's disciplined enough to be able to set their own goals and agenda would be able to get the international partners who genuinely want to help to basically, orient their programs towards it, provided, of course, that the country's government is seen to be using resources effectively and efficiently. So what ASET we do is basically to promote the idea of economic transformation, which means economies that are seriously about, government with the capacity to set up a vision after consulting with the people and to actually create the type of growth that produces employment opportunities led by the private sector. Mm-hmm. I think once you have that in the country is able to set that agenda, it doesn't matter how many outside blueprints come in. At the end of the day, the country will have the capacity to decide, to choose among what they think is relevant and to move along with it. So the SDGs are what they are. They set up a framework. If the cost of getting everybody on board is 107 or 150 indicators, fine. But I think a smart country and a smart leadership in a country should be able to know what's important to them and to shape their strategies accordingly. And in ASET, a big part of what we do is to try to assist our governments and countries to try to make those choices.
Excellent, thank you. All right, I want to open it up. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of views here and questions. I believe, all right, so we got some mics. They're getting the mics prepared. So does anyone have any specific questions or thoughts that they want to share? And we'll take them in groups of 3 to try and keep us moving along. All right, so we have here, and here, and here.
John Thorne with the Woodrow Wilson Center here in DC. My question to the Pew Research representative is, why was this survey conducted so late in the process if the goal was to inform the SDGs process? From the African perspective, it seems to me that it's too late to inform the deliberation in New York. I'm just curious about that. And also maybe to the organizers. The real topic here is development from African perspective. So why do we only have one African on the panel? Thank you.
And like the gentleman there, if you could introduce yourself as well.
I'm Ed Almondar, formerly from the World Bank. I wanted to unpack a bit further the Pew data, which take foreign aid as a whole without looking at different foreign aid institutions, different foreign aid modalities, and partners. Wondered, for example, whether there was examination of USAID versus the multilaterals, the World Bank versus the UN, and finally about the NGO community. There was no reference to NGO partnership in development cooperation. If you could expand on that, I'd appreciate it.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then we have here, don't worry, we'll have a couple of rounds. So we'll give people an opportunity. It's up front. I see you in the next row too as well.
Thank you. I'm Ritu Sharma with the Center for Strategic and International Studies and International Youth Foundation. So just a question and then sort of a contribution. First, and everyone who knows me will laugh that I will ask this question, but was your data sex disaggregated? And did you look at the different views of men versus women on all of these questions? And can you give us any insights on that? And then the second is that we at CSIS just completed a report called What Youth Want. That is a youth-led agenda for global development. And you can find it on our website at whatyouthwant.csis.org. But very interestingly, the findings very much align closely with yours in that jobs, number one, number two, education, number three, corruption and good governance. So very interesting that when looking at the youth opinion sort of breakout, very much aligned with yours. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. All right, so I think all three of those questions were directed at you, Katie. So I think the rest, the rest of us will go to sleep for a few minutes.
I'll get
You'll
to
keep
it.
us.
Well,
You'll keep us
hopefully
awake.
I'll be interesting
Of
enough.
course.
Yes. So in terms of the timing, a couple things. I mean, it sounds like there were a lot of people involved in the process with coming up with the SDGs already. I'm not sure a survey from the Pew Research Center would have changed anything. We do hope, however, that it can have an influence on how maybe they're implemented or how people think about them moving forward. I do think healthcare and education are covered in the 156 goals or whatever the number is now. But yeah, I mean, we are on a yearly process, and so this was part of a larger survey, and that's why it was done this year. In terms of foreign aid as a whole, I would have loved to ask 20 questions on foreign aid organizations and get into the nitty-gritty and more of the details. And so this was really a first attempt to get an overview about how people think about development and think about these different institutions and organizations who are involved in it. There is also somewhat of a concern about knowledge levels and how much do people know about USAID versus the UN and therefore have a formed opinion. And so you need to be careful in terms of asking these questions that you're not creating opinions, that you're actually measuring opinions that they have. In terms of demographics, we do have enough in our sample size to look at the differences between men and women. We didn't find a lot of differences between men and women on these questions. We also tend to look at demographics where we see patterns across all of the countries. That's one of the limitations of a cross-national, is that we try to highlight differences that we see in multiple countries. But if you have an interest in a particular country, we can definitely look up the crosstabs for you and let you know if we see gender there. I will say on youth, we did find a couple cases where there were some consistent differences between younger people and older people on some of the questions. So one of the questions was about the priorities. And so for the most part, healthcare was a top priority for everybody within the societies where that rose to the top. But we did find that the percentage of people saying that education is a top priority was somewhat higher among young people than it was among those 50 and older. And this was true, I think, in 6 of the 9 countries, something around there, where you do see young people are prioritizing education somewhat more than their elders. We also found that young people were more optimistic about the economy and about the future in South Africa and Kenya. And so there was a real gap there between young people and older people on the economy.
Great. Thank you very much.
Can I?
Yeah.
I'm glad actually you asked the question about the unpacking the foreign aid, because we've talked a lot this morning about the priorities. But the thing that I actually think is most useful in terms of the data of this report for those of us in Washington is it actually doesn't just talk about the what, but it talks about the how. And I think it really has interesting insights for how we think about the changing role of international development. We saw that Africans have faith in their own governments to deliver the change that they want to see. And their views are right. Their governments are going to be the ones that drive the change or don't drive the change. But those are the key actors in this process. And so what does that mean for those of us who work in international development? Well, it means that we have to be supporting local capacity in order for the systems to be strong, in order to deliver the change as we work ourselves out of a job. But it also means that in this process, we need to support and strengthen accountability between governments and their people. So that means supporting transparency and accountability, building the capacity of civil society or strengthening their ability to be able to engage with their governments around these issues, and being transparent about what we're doing as a donor so they can hold their governments accountable for what's happening with these aid dollars. So I think that there's a lot of implications for us as aid professionals about how we do this, and we have to actually measure this and hold ourselves accountable for these things. So a lot of the measurement in the field of international development is focused either on outputs or outcomes, but how many teachers are we training or other kinds of things, how many bed nets are getting handed out, whatever the intervention is. But we also have to start measuring ourselves about how we're strengthening local capacity to know if what we're doing is sustainable or not sustainable. And that's something we need to do within each of our aid agencies, but we also should look at, are there ways that we can measure this across aid agencies? And MFAN actually has a paper on metrics with some ideas on how to do this that you'll find outside, and I hope you'll take a look at it, because we think that if you count it, we will be accountable for it, and it will make a difference.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. All right. I saw a bunch of other hands before. Okay, so I'm going to continue to try and get from different groups. So I have in the back in the middle. Okay, I see you now. I didn't see you before. And here, and I saw you before as well. So let's start in the back in the middle.
Hi, I'm Karen Attia with the Washington Post. So 2 quick questions. So these are 8 or 9 countries out of 54. So how representative can we feel that this survey is of African attitudes towards aid and development? And also, with regards to some of the countries that are on the list, especially Ethiopia, say even Kenya and Tanzania, some of these countries are countries that are increasingly cracking down on NGOs, on foreign aid, and even increasing repression. So how does that factor in? How should Washington factor into that? As well as these are a lot of countries that are quite stable, not a whole lot of countries that are coming from post-conflict situations. So how should we address that? Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Karen. Thank you for those questions, and I'm really pleased you're here. Then we also had a question up here.
Hi. I wasn't going to speak, but since we're talking so much about youth, I thought I'll give it a try. I'm Nicole. I'm a very new Internet Save the Children. And I was thinking about, something that surprises me constantly is now I'm a student and an intern, and I find there's a lot of distance between rhetoric and practice. I hear a lot about ownership all the time, but I don't know how much it translates once you're working in the field. And especially regarding youth, I hear a lot about focus on youth and youth's voices. I'm really glad to hear about that. I'm going to read that report. But what about youth participation? Does that translate? Because I constantly, whenever I've jumped into a lot of experiences where whenever I start talking, because of my age, people just shut their brain off, especially when I'm working. And I think it's really good that we're starting to pay more attention to our opinion, but what about paying attention to what we actually want to do and how we want to participate, and once we want to actually contribute in the spaces where we can contribute and not only say our opinion and then that just vanishes. So what is your intake about the future of youth participation and engagement? Do you think it's going to improve? Do you think it's going to continue the same. I don't know.
Great.
Just about that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And then we have right here. Yeah.
Thanks. Hi, it's Maureen Greenwood-Baskin with Wellspring Advisors. And thanks so much for the data. It's extremely useful. My question goes more towards to the how. So Nora, you kind of anticipated it. But, yes, U.S. foreign assistance is one lever of social change, but there's also the private sector, the philanthropic community, NGOs setting their own agendas. So it'd be great to hear from the other panelists on the how. If we were going to imagine a better way, let's take the issue of jobs. Countries are prioritizing the issues of jobs. How do you then see the SDGs, U.S. foreign assistance, the private sector, corporate community? What would I know MFAN has worked on this a lot, but it'd be good to hear from everybody on what does the alternative vision look like?
Great, thank you so much. All right, so beyond that question, we had the one from Karen from the Washington Post on how representative is this list of 9 countries in terms of getting broader regional perspectives, which I think is a dangerous path to go down. But we'll hear what you say, and then as well a question about some of the NGO repression and suppression of free media and things like that in a number of these countries, as well as the questions about how much does ownership and youth empowerment translate, and touching on the voice and political power and engagement as well. On that last one, I want to make a special effort to bring you back in, Dr. Ansu, because it is difficult to engage when you're not in the room. So my job is to bring you into the room. You mentioned before issues of employment, youth employment. I'm curious if you have additional thoughts about the voice and the political power and engagement of youth, whether it's in Ghana or other countries where you're actively engaged. The ambassador and I were talking about this in the green room before coming out here. But I want to bring you into that, as well as, of course, if you have thoughts on any of the other questions that just came or referenced before.
Okay, thank you. First, on the question of representativeness of the sample, I'm sure Pew Research people can deal with that. But from what I said, even though this is only 9 out of 54 countries, at some point, if you ask yourself, what is the ultimate objective of the assistance, is to help people. And if you take the population of these 9 countries, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Nigeria, close to about 200 million people, Ethiopia, 90 to 100 million, South Africa and stuff. You have a hefty chunk of the African population in these 9 countries. So it may not be represented in terms of number of countries, but if the objective is actually helping individuals, then I think it does a fairly decent job. In terms of the youth, look, I think that in each country, there should be space for free expression of everybody without discrimination to whether it's youth, old, young, or so. Once that is done, and as the ambassador started saying, the median age of most of these countries is about 17, 18 or lower. And for the youth, really having the education and the skills training opportunity and an economy that's being run in such a way that when they come out of school, they have jobs. To me, that's critical, that's central. And if they have the space to participate in the democracy, the rest of it is detail. To me, education, job opportunities, and an open environment for everybody to participate, that's critical.
That's great.
Well, ditto. I agree with everything that you just said. I guess a couple of thoughts. Whether or not this is representative of, quote unquote, Africa, I think it is useful for issue spotting. Again, we believe very much that assistance should be mission-driven, local level-driven, so every country is different, and that's the way you help to address the differences between countries. But thank you so much for your question and your point regarding crackdown on civil society and media. There's a rising authoritarianism in many parts of the world, in many ways, unfortunately, inspired by Russia and China, where they seek to criminalize civil society, criminalize independent media in some cases, and really crack down on the ability of the NGO community and their partners to take on some of these causes. And I think it's very dangerous and something that we really do need to pay attention to. Very, very important. With respect to youth participation, again, we have launched something called Generation Democracy to try to network young people and to create constructive opportunities for dialogue and input. You're right, it's not simply saying, okay, young people, I'll do education. It's obviously much more than that. It's creating an opportunity for young people to engage constructively, continuously, have their voices heard. I was in Tanzania recently, where 80% of Tanzanians are under the age of like 32, and the young people said to me, how do we ensure that they listen to us? 80%. I used to be in politics. Fire them. That's what elections are for. If you get involved, you have the ability to do that, and we really do need to foster that. With respect to the private sector, I cannot emphasize enough the key role of private investment in these countries and mobilizing economies and creating opportunities. We've all talked about, naturally, the limitations of any survey, but the interesting question is not simply the question of jobs, very important question, but are they fulfilling jobs? So young people in many parts of Africa have jobs. They work in the garden, or they work in the informal economy. That's hardly what many aspire to. And so it is creating a vibrancy in the economy that creates real opportunity so that there is a chance that they can have what their brothers and sisters in other countries and other parts of the world have. And I think what we've seen in places like Tunisia is where young people see those opportunities as being limited or slipping away, then you see engagement. Not always the constructive engagement, but you see engagement, and it's something that we need to be part of. With respect to, for example, the pharmaceuticals, I think what many of the pharmaceutical companies have done to help deliver low-cost, life-saving medicines is a great story. And I think that tapping into and partnering with some of these wonderful technologies, transferring the technology so that it's produced on the continent locally by Africans, again, so they can take on their own challenges, I think is a great opportunity. As was said earlier, none of these issues are partisan. In fact, if we ever let them be partisan, we've made a terrible mistake because they're not sustainable. All these ideas have to be taken up in a bipartisan way. But if you take a look at some of the themes coming from the Bush administration and the Obama administration, there is a thread of continuity. You've got the administration saying, look, President Obama said, look, we want to end foreign assistance by making it unnecessary. And that's a theme that I think we all can embrace. We may have some differences in how we get there, but I think tapping into the private sector, fostering the private sector, leveraging the private sector by partnering some of our assistance programs with economic opportunities, to me that's the right answer.
Great. All right, so I'm looking at the clock. We have about 5 minutes for our set closing time. I want to be able to get one more round of questions, but I want to give Nora and Katie an opportunity to quickly address some of the last round of questions, and then we're going to go into lightning round. Okay.
Just real quickly on the representativeness on the survey. Obviously, we wish we could do more countries in Africa, but we have to balance our resources with our demands of doing a global survey in other regions as well. I will say that these 9 countries, as was mentioned earlier, that they cover over half of the population in sub-Saharan Africa. They cover 54%. They also cover a wide range of the level of economies, level of GDP in the region. And so, for example, we have Ethiopia and Uganda, which are poor relative to some of the other countries in sub-Saharan Africa, but then we also have South Africa and Nigeria. So it's not a representative sample in that we sampled countries from, you know, all economies and all conflict or post-conflict. And there are limitations there in terms of covering post-conflict states and security for interviewers on the ground. But we do hope that it's informative in terms of the number of countries that we have.
Any quick thoughts before we go to the next lightning round?
I'll just have a quick response to the how question, which is that so Save the Children, I think a lot of people know we work in health and education, and almost all of our work in those sectors is actually working with the government systems. We're working at the community level, but we're strengthening the school system, we're strengthening the health system. But in the question of jobs, one of the things that's different is our partnerships are different. And so, for example, one of our big areas of focus in livelihoods is actually making sure youth have the skills to succeed. So we're working with youth where they are, which for many of them it's actually not in school, but we're actually partnering with the private sector and private companies, many of whom are actually foreign direct investors who are creating jobs in that, are bringing us in to help make sure that they have a youth-friendly workplace and that they're actually enabling youth to develop the skills that they need not only for the job that they're in, but the job they want to go to. So we're partnering in the place where the youth are, but partnering with a different set of partners to help create that pathway.
All right, lightning round. We'll do a couple of questions. So we got here. Now, do you still have a question? All right. You were outside of my line of sight, so I wanted to make sure and get you. And then right here, and then we'll take those three. And for those of you who didn't get an opportunity, I don't know if the panelists have to run off, and it's a little more difficult to connect with Dr. Ansu, but we can try and think about how to handle that as well if there was some more for him that weren't able to be brought up here. Please.
Hi, my name's Tina Masoke. I'm a development communicator with the United Nations Foundation. I know this question was asked before, but I'm just going to put it up there. I'm a PR person, so one of the big things at the end of event, we take the big money shot that's going to go out, that we're going to pitch to media, we're going to do something like this. When I think of taking this money shot right now, all I see is, having 4 Caucasians on a panel talking about what Africans and African priorities are, with the lone African who would actually be out of the shot in the picture. What does that, in a city like Washington, D.C., that is thriving with huge diaspora and Save the Children and all, in all your organizations and everything, you do have a representation of this. I'm just wondering why this happened at this time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Happy to talk about that. And then we had over here.
Gary Filerman, former. Georgetown and actually Pew. I have a question about the use of the word health or the use of the word education. Can you disaggregate those terms? Health in particular, it's a microcosm which everything you're talking about comes together, the external agenda versus the internal agenda and so on. But can you take it to the next level so that we can think about the operational implications?
Okay. And then where was we had one over here, and I've since forgotten. Yes, it was up here.
I'm going to do this backwards. My 2 issues are, and then I'll tell you where I'm coming from. The 2 issues are, how do you really encourage the local community councils, village councils, and maybe new communities to take a real stand in local sustainable development? And then how do you attach back to the local and federal government to get the services they need? I worked for over 20 years developing the National Health Interview Survey in the US, so I love surveys. I'm not doing that anymore. I'm one of the co-founders of the Yale Alumni Service Corps. We've worked in a number of countries. We've fallen in love with Ghana. We are working in Yamoussoukro. I get a phone call from the newly re-elected assemblywoman, only 6 months late, every Sunday on progress. And in addition to the village councils, there is a new community development committee. We also have a local university, Cape Coast University, working with us. And everybody wants the health center back. And we have been trying top down and bottom up to get the Ministry of Health to do that, and they have been oblivious.
Okay, thank you for that. All right, so we will just quickly, I'm going to quickly go through each of the panelists for very fast reactions or thoughts. And Dr. Ansu, we don't expect you to solve the health clinic challenge just because you're based in Accra. But if you have any quick thoughts or any parting thoughts as well, and then we'll quickly go down the line.
Really, I think all the questions were directed to the people in the panel up there. So only to say thanks for inviting me, and thanks for the good work that Pew Research Center is doing. And I hope this discussion informs the next survey so that they improve on an already good work. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us today. And I'm actually going to be in Accra next month, and I'm hoping to look you up.
Look me up.
Yeah. But thank you for sharing your thoughts and ideas. Ambassador.
Sure, a couple of reactions. So IRI, despite our name, we're not a partisan organization. We also have many more foreign employees than we have American employees in our Africa program. It's dominated by Africans, obviously, as it should be. But the question about any individual health center gets back at this idea of fostering the consultative democratic process in each of the places where we work. So the answer isn't to come to any of us as Americans or Westerners and say, can you go get that council back? It's to obviously create a reactive, citizen-centered, citizen-based democratic system, governing system that allows countries to take on their own challenges based upon citizen needs. So that, to me, is the answer, and that's sort of the piece of it that we try to work on.
Great, thank you. Katie.
I guess the one point that I would say is that what we value at the Pew Research Center are our local research partners. And so we work very closely with them to get their feedback on the questionnaire, the types of questions that we're asking, their opinions on how to implement the survey. So we work very closely with them. So we recognize the optics, but we also recognize how important it is to have expertise on the ground doing the survey. And that is key to us and to our success at being able to do surveys that look right to people, that make sense to people, the findings are right.
Nora.
So I'm going to be a little bit provocative and see if I ever get invited back to CGD. And I'm not going to speak to the question of the composition of this panel. But what I am going to speak to is the question is, what is the conversation we need to be having here in Washington, D.C.? And just like racism in America is not a problem of communities of color, racism in America is a problem of white people. And white people need to be getting together to talk about how they are addressing racism in America. Country-led development, Africans are leading their own development, regardless of who's on this panel here. Economies are growing, they're strengthening their health systems, things are changing, it's dynamic, the optimism they have is real. But what I would say is the question that we need to have here in Washington is, are we going to lead, follow, or get out of the way? Now, this isn't a place for us to lead, right? The North has tried, the donor countries have tried leading. It doesn't work, it's not our role. So the question is, how do we at least get out of the way, and can we even follow? And I think that's the important conversation for us to have in here. And what are the policy reforms? What is the political voice that we can create here in Washington so we can actually follow that leadership? And I think that is a really important conversation for us to have. So I hope that we can actually continue this conversation while we're also listening to our African colleagues who are leading and driving this change.
Thank you, Nora. I appreciate that. And parting thoughts. So first, I want to thank everyone again from the presenters and the panelists, as well as all of you that are here today. And in many ways, one of the last questions was directed at me, and it came up earlier. And I've tried to touch on this in my introductory remarks in terms of the framing for the discussion. And the idea for this was to showcase and highlight some of the rich survey data that is coming that gets at some of the core policy issues with reactions, thoughts, and ideas from arguably the leading African think tank on the continent, and then other panelists, the DC-based panelists that have extremely rich experience from policy and advocacy perspectives, and who are also working with two of the major umbrella organizations that are trying to make positive change. We could have structured it a little differently. I thought it was great, and I thought we heard some really good perspectives. But this goes back to a positive side of ending the event, in that I personally and others have been doing a lot of policy research on this idea in terms of alignment with aid activities with most pressing priorities for several years, and we'll continue to do that. But the key thing is that this is just one part of a broader discussion and an agenda that needs to happen to make sure that there is better integration of viewpoints, perceptions, and attitudes from ordinary people on the ground, whether it's in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, South Asia, other places, and how that directly feeds back into policy decisions and how programs are structured. That, in a nutshell, that was what we're hoping to showcase today. We're going to have further discussions, and I would love to talk with you and the gentleman from the Wilson Center about how we could best do that, whether it's private discussions, public discussions, a range of different engagement models. But I appreciate you being here today and sharing your viewpoint as well, and I appreciate it. So thank you. And for the rest of you, I want to thank you for being here again. I think this was great, and as I said, it's not a one-off. I don't like to think of one-off events. It's part of an ongoing discussion. So I look forward to hopefully having you as part of some of those discussions again going forward, and showcasing and really emphasizing this very important set of issues. So thank you all very much.
Good.